We're very happy to host Danny Dorling today. So he's a professor of human geography, just geography, at Oxford. Wrote, I'd say like the first half of your career was more like demography oriented and now more social inequalities. Is that fair to say?
Yep.
I'm going to present today about, I guess, migration measures and net cohort lifetime immigration and migration. And yeah, I mean, I'll let you take this time and explain.
Okay. Thanks ever so much. And you're going to be strict and keep me to half an hour.
Yes.
These slides are really just to give you something else to look at other than me. I've got to the point in my life where I'm running out of time to do things, and I just want to give ideas away of stuff I won't do. I only ever did one thing which was slightly clever, which was when I was about 20, 21. I worked out that if you had a load of circles, and you made each circle the size of the number of people who lives in an area, and then you tell the circles to move towards each other if they neighbour and away from each other if they overlap in a gravity model, just like little lunar lander models that if you were geeky in the 1970s you would program. If you did that, it didn't work, it didn't create a nice picture, because you would get slingshots. You'd get tiny little moons coming in, zipping around the planet and zooming off. Right? Very exciting in terms of computer graphics, not very good for getting a picture. If you slowed the movement of these circles around by a quarter, exactly a quarter, you solved the free body problem, all your circles gently came to rest, and you could create a population cartogram. And that was it. That's all I did for my PhD. I worked out that you had to slow it down by a quarter. Lots of other people solved the problem at the same time. They weren't interested in making population cartograms. They were interested in making those diagrams, where you count the number of times the words in a document and you produce circles. All of those. It's exactly the same thing. So it wasn't that clever. But sadly, that's the last clever thing I did. It was a long time ago. I've had two other ideas, and I'm going to mainly tell you about one of them. But one's where I thought, if I could start again and I was 18 again, what would I look at? One is to do with genetics, where I've had an on-off interest because I look at inequality since 2005. I've had an on-off interest in people who look at the genetics of inequality and whether some people are superior to the others. I don't happen to like this. I'm left-wing, as will probably become obvious. But there are lots of papers, normally written by people who believe they're very clever, about inherited intelligence. And in some of the demography books I've done, I have footnotes, which I should really take together and put together, which suggest that this collection of a whole set of genes which they think may be related to being clever isn't related to intelligence, because there's no reason why we should evolve to have some clever people and some stupid people. It's actually related to greed, and some of us may be more inherently greedy than others, and that may be inherited from our parents. It will devolve, it doesn't last forever, but among us there are the greedy, and the genes for intelligence are actually genes for wanting to grab more for yourself. And I think this is a really interesting idea. The best paper was one published with Toby Young, if you know him, as one of the authors. Toby Young thinks he's genetically very clever. I suspect he's actually maybe a bit inherently greedy. But I won't say anything more than that, but if anybody's interested, I'd love to point towards it. Because if it's true, if there really are selfish genes that make some people more selfish, so they grab more money, and they pay for their children to go to schools where they get A's and then they think they're very clever, it's quite a big thing. And then sometimes these people who think they're very clever, who become very greedy, get lots of money, and then they buy a country, and then they take a chainsaw to a local and national government and so on. So it's fairly important. This is not as exciting an idea, and I'm almost 90% sure that one of you is going to tell me this has been done and is actually an area of study that I should have known about. or a good reason why it isn't useful. You've had enough time to read that, and I am going to keep to time. I wrote this up in 2009, when the think tank IPPR was asking a lot of people to do work on migration. And it was asking them to do work on migration because one of the largest donors to IPPR, anonymous donor, was a businessman who wasn't from Britain, and he was really annoyed about people being racist, essentially. But I wasn't funded, I just agreed to write something. And I found a pattern that I thought was very interesting. And the maths of it's really easy. I'm going to show you the complicated maths, but it isn't that hard. It's essentially saying that the records that we have for countries that are of the highest quality, and again, you can correct me, I'm doing this for my own selfish purposes, I'm in the right place to find out, hopefully, if I'm very wrong. The best records that we have are births. Not perfect, people could be born without the birth being recorded, but in general, births are pretty good. Best for Sweden since 1751, but thanks to Bill and Melinda, paying people to vaccinate every baby on Earth, we've got really good at counting the births now, because you find the babies, you vaccinate them, Bill and Melinda and the Gates Foundation gives you money. And the second best data we have is deaths. We know people die without their deaths being recorded. The best evidence in Britain was the police officer trying to find Lord Lucan, by the way, on this, for estimates of number of bodies under motorway construction and so on. But in general, 99.99% of deaths are recorded. So you've got two things that are very well recorded. And then you've got migration, which is never easy to record. But births and deaths allow you to work out a single one measure of migration, which is the net lifetime cohort migration. The number of people born in a particular year who have left the country minus the number born in that year from all the rest of the world who've come into the country. And because that calculation is just based on births and deaths, you get a figure you can be fairly sure is pretty accurate. And then you can look at that and say, does it tell you something about the role of migration? The disadvantage of this, or my hope as to why this hasn't been of interest, is you can only tell this for completed cohorts. So they've all got to have died. So it doesn't tell you much about the present. I got interested in this because of somebody called Ravenstein, and because I did geography at the point where we had to learn Ravenstein's supposed laws of migration. Ravenstein got interested because somebody called William Farr. William Farr, interestingly, produced the first curves of spread of a pandemic, which fit remarkably well to COVID. And it's interesting how things in a very distant past can actually be useful. It was a remark of William Farr to the effect that migration appeared to go without any definite law, just looked random, or some aspects of it looked random. They got Ravenstein working out a set of things which appeared to be less random. It's very unfashionable in geography to have laws. I like doing things that are unfashionable, so I'd love to write a book about the laws of geography to get completely slated by geographers. It's one of my last books. Things we can be certain about. This is one set. What's funny about the laws is they're still taught. So I've just, there's a little web address there. I've just Googled around for this seminar to see who's putting up slides of Ravenstein's laws and how have they, by Chinese whispers, altered. But there's one set. And okay, some of them will be a bit silly. You know, females may not always be more migratory than males, and you'll notice a line across Europe. When in the distant past, men walked one way and then the women walked to the village, and we can tell from genes and all these kind of things. But that's one set of the regularities that were thought in the 1880s to exist. I'm always interested in people saying there isn't enough data, by the way, because these folk were working with remarkably little data to come up with stuff. Here's a set of 11. There was a second paper which introduced some more. that I'll just put them up so you can see, when you look at them, you can see the things that obviously aren't laws because they're just specific to the UK at that time, in hindsight. But there are still things that are really interesting. You know, why for so long it has been women who try to, I think, escape the circumstances of their birth and families and move more, and what happens to the men who move a bit slower and why. But I'll leave that up and just show you a graph. So there's the graph. This is Sweden. The rest of what I'm going to show you is England and Wales. The graph is showing you along the top is births, and that's on the right-hand axis, and it's in thousands, and it's from 1750 all the way up to 1910. And the births kind of go up and up. Interesting tiny fluctuations to do with harvests, cold winters, wars. And then the wonder of the condom. Some other things going on, but basically, and it wasn't the condom, it was having, at least in the case in England, putting Annie Besant and Charles Bradlaugh on trial for the temerity of producing a pamphlet about this thing that you could put over your penis that meant something didn't happen. And that trial, in the British demographic data, it's wonderful, because that trial, 9 months after that trial, is when babies start to fall, when the middle class realised about contraception more than they have. But of course, this spreads worldwide, and you can see that the Swedish births simply flatline, population still rising, births flatline. The interesting thing is the net cohort migration, which is that Sweden, as it had more babies, had more and more emigration. There's a world to emigrate to. Life in Sweden is hard, poor, tricky, lots of alcohol, not much fun. There's the USA to go to. There is exploitation, there is potential for revolution, there's a royal family. I won't embarrass myself more about my lack of knowledge of Sweden. But then that emigration turns and falls at precisely the moment when the births stop rising. Okay. I've got the maths which shows the kind of thing I tried to show off in 2009, which is very silly, but it's all about, for any of you who work with this data, just because you know how many babies are born in a year doesn't mean you can tie up to the deaths. It's all about 6 months differences and so on. We can ignore all of that, and we can ignore all me trying to show I'm clever as I make the equation larger and larger and larger, and just get down to the bottom. And the bottom simply says, you take everybody who has died, so let's take the year 1900, you take births in 1900 and 1901 and divide them by 2 to get the number of people who are born. And then you take everybody who died at age 0 in 1900, age 1 in 1901, age 2 in 1902, all the way up to age 100 in the year 2000. You subtract the births from the deaths, and that tells you how many people net, this weird concept of a net migrant. You know, they don't exist, they're like ghosts. But how many people net have either left or arrived. The orange line there is, this is England and Wales now, the net migration. Hence, FAR's saying this thing appears to go without any rhyme or reason. Okay, the orange one goes all up and down all over the place. It goes off to scale when you've got world wars. The axis for the orange line is on the right-hand side. When it's negative, you've got net immigration. And you can see in more recent years, in the 50s and 60s, you've got particular years of quite high net immigration. Before then, England and Wales were more often than not in a year net emigration countries. This isn't cohort, this is just what people normally look at. But it looks pretty random. The black line is births. And you can see the date of that trial, and you can also see the baby booms associated with the wars. So on in there. So I'm interested in turning the orange line into something that's less random. My view of human beings, think of yourselves. You're all billiard balls. You all started off somewhere. You bounce around the country and the planet. You don't know where you're going to end up. We don't know where you're going to end up. But whether you stay in a particular place depends on what it's like. Whether there's something for you to do, whether people need you, whether they persuade you. Please, we've got some temporary teaching. Somebody's gone on maternity leave. Would you mind doing it for a year? Right? You meet somebody else. The fun stuff about migration is always about falling in love. And then what the hell do you do when you meet her and she meets you and you're on a beach in the middle of nowhere? And the answer is, you go to where she comes from. Anyway, just don't want to break it to people, but that tends to be what happens. You go to where she comes from, and then you have the baby, and then you have to get on with the parents, her parents. But whether you stay there or not depends on the opportunities that there are for you. Billion to individual billiard balls moving around. But if the circumstances are right, more stay, and if they're wrong, more leave. And so what you're seeing in the orange line is the random movement of the billiard balls. What you're now seeing in the blue line is the net cohort migration for those years. In theory, completely unrelated to births, even though I've used births to calculate it, the blue line isn't related to births. It literally is the sum of people who've come in minus those who've come out over the course of the entire lifetimes of everybody on the planet born in that year. And they track each other remarkably well, ridiculously well. My worry here, really serious worry, is it's revealing an error in the data. It's showing you that the human mortality database that the nice folk in Berkeley and so on put together isn't perfect. But I don't suspect that is the case. I suspect you're actually looking at what looks like one of Ravenstein's potential laws. That births are one of the biggest influences on net cohort migration. So, I don't know if haven't got a little thing, but if you've got a year or a few years in which very few people are born, say the First World War, because the men are out there in the Somme and the women are at home being patriotic, and the one thing that isn't going on is sex. If you've got years like the years of the First World War, then there are missing people. Those people are the people who would have been born if we hadn't been stupid enough to have started a war we thought would last a few weeks and goes on for years and so on. But what a rich country can do, like England and Wales, or like Sweden, without even trying to do it, without even knowing it's doing it, is replace those children who were never born by that little rise around 1918, 1920, a little bit younger, a little rise of people from outside the rest of the world, born in the years in which the babies were not born in England and Wales, who end up spending the rest of their life here, who were just passing through at some point. They might have been coming, I don't know, from Russia because they're fleeing a revolution, and they find themselves in Merthyr Tydfil, and there's work down a coal mine. But they get that job in the coal mine and they stay in the coal mine because they're not competing with a child who's not born in 1916 and then is not a 20-year-old in 1936. And you can carry this on. So you can look at the very low births in the 1930s when whatever the equivalent of OPCS was, I've forgotten what it was before, OPCS was before ONS, but there was a government statistical service in the 30s. And they projected that England and Wales would run out of people if the fertility of the 30s carried on. Well, it didn't. We just got more people migrating in who were born in the 1930s. They were born in Trinidad and Jamaica, and they were born in India, and they're born in what's now Pakistan, which wasn't then. But they replaced the people who were not born in the 30s. And then for each echo of the war baby booms, net cohort migration appears to smooth it out for a rich place like England and Wales. So the interesting thing is, and the tricky thing is, the really good data is for the rich countries, right? The interesting thing is what happens in future. To what extent is this true? my view is that you can have any kind of migration control you want. All it does is alter who you get. So you can be really, really nasty. You can make it hard. You can do Brexit to really piss people off. Tell people from the mainland you don't like them. That we're actually capable of being racist to people who are whiter than us, which I never thought was possible, but we did it. All that happens is instead of getting people from mainland Europe, you get people from other parts of the world. Let's go forward a few more. So this is the proportion of population added because of net cohort migration. Interestingly, 1840, 1850 births, we were a net immigrant, England and Wales. A little bit because of what was happening in Ireland, I suspect, nearby, and I'll show you in a minute, we know other things. Then that blue line goes below zero for decade after decade after decade, as we spew our excess population off from the highlands and from the towns and the poor around the rest of the planet. The really unwanted ones had to get on a ship to New Zealand. That's, I think, the saddest migration routes of all, is how on earth you ended up on a ship to New Zealand. Until eventually we're not having so many babies that we're not colonising the rest of the planet or particular parts of the planet. And then we become net immigration, and then that flat line is the projections. Remember, I did this in 2009, so you can kind of compare, but the projections are just sort of partly silly. I don't know what I do, but I don't think I produce straight line projections. I'd at least take into account global baby booms. This is the same thing, but here the black line is the contribution due to immigration, the orange is due to births, and you can see the immigration in future matters much more. The immigration measure being net cohort migration, like the thing we can be fairly certain about. And you can work it out in the future. You simply use the population projections of births and deaths. So in the past it's a reality, in the future it's a way of looking at the validity or the plausibility of your past projections, of your future projections. This is the most complicated graph. This is taking, on the vertical scale, this net measure of migration based on birth. I've got 2 minutes left. I'm determined. Okay. And births along the side. In theory, these two shouldn't be related. But you can see how closely they're related are. I've coloured the time series using 3 colours to suggest that there are points where things changed or turned in it. And it shifts downwards as we build more housing, which relates to your PhD. This is a bigger yes, just to annoy you. Because as you build more housing, as there's more space, you've got more space to fill. And then the really interesting thing is, well, why does it turn at particular years, unless that's an error in the human mortality database? And what happens if you don't just do it for England and Wales, but you do it for all the Nordic countries? You do it using reconstructions of past records, which have now been done for countries where the population records weren't collected by churches and so on meticulously in the past. And what happens when you try and look at the countries that are more donor countries? I did a project called World Mapper with 5 other people, and the most fun thing we did in World Mapper was do the international accounts of migration, where we knew for every country in the world with data how many people had turned up, sometimes from every other country. We knew how many people had left. And then we worked out very crudely that if we included Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia and a few other places that even back then, in 2006, had no data, we could get the globe to balance, and we produced maps of net out and net in migration. If we're being really cynical, excluding 7 people. Anybody guess about why I excluded 7? It's very childish, really. It's a space shuttle. Anyway, because it balances. This is the great thing. It's that those who left the Earth and never came back. Not telling you anything much different. This is from the census. This took Beth and Thomas, my collaborator, weeks of work to go through the censuses and work out just where people came from. The purple's Ireland. Okay, and then you get a whole plethora. if we're the USA in the past, we produce atlas about atlas of our wonderful multiculturalism. But anyway, we have that data, so we know where people are from. I'll skip that because I've gone on about it too much. I promised to say something about Easterlin. This is the narcissism. So Easterlin is somebody who carried on from Ravenstein, and he's actually got a paradox and a hypothesis named after him in Wikipedia. You can tell I'm jealous. Well, all I've done is create one population cartogram, that's just one. But he was somebody who looks at these things, and I think he got it largely right. The criticisms of him since are based on the weird circumstances of how the United States became a basket case. So you can ruin a country so badly that Easterlin's essential laws don't matter, but it kind of proves not that his laws are wrong, but that the United States became truly awful as a place to live in. And I'll leave that one on as my last one. My last one is about what I'm talking about later. So that's half an hour, and I cannot believe, I'm really worried I've missed something. I can't believe that this is a useful measure and it hasn't been spotted. So either this is a useful measure, it has been spotted, but there's not much you can do with it, or it isn't useful to look at net cohort migration figures and projections as a different way of looking at migration, which doesn't rely on the estimates that countries make about how many people actually do move, because it's just much more reliable, and it tells you something about which places have economic power and opportunity and which don't over the entire course of lifetimes. Right? Not a very short thing. Obviously, at particular ages, people are more likely to move. But it's telling us, if you like, if we're to look at it for England and Wales in the long term, at what point does England and Wales become an undesirable place to be? Which is not yet, because you can carry on being desirable for a long time based on a language that's international and Manchester United Football Club and other reasons that people give for why they crossed over the Sahara on foot to get here, and having family and connections. But what places were places that were attractive and stopped being attractive? What places were not attractive, which is often a lot of Europe, but thanks to the Lutheran Church they recorded them and then became attractive? At what point did Finland actually start to be a place that more people move to than leave? So its second city can celebrate getting to 200,000, which may not sound much, but it's the highest it's ever been, and have a festival thanking the migrants. And, most importantly, what's going to happen in future? Because we know a huge amount about births in future. We know the births, of course, that have happened, but we also know no evidence that men like Orban and Putin and Musk can force women to have more children. They try, it doesn't work. We have projections from the UN every 2 years that for the last 3 or 4 times have moved fertility down. Apologies if it isn't the right word to use, by the way, I do need updating, but basically numbers of babies that people have down in future from what was thought to be the case. We're now looking at 2084 as the peak human population year. It was 2086 2 years ago. It's probably going to be 2077, if I was going to guess, when it actually happens. Give or take a third world war and all the other things that muck it up. And people will carry on being footloose. They carry on moving. You can get people to give up their car if you're trying to make them green. It's interesting what sacrifices you can get people to do. You can get them to recycle. You can get them to be more careful about the clothes they buy and how long they last and all kinds of things. But one thing you cannot get people to do is to stop them moving when they want to move. It's what George Monbiot calls love miles. It's mainly because his sister lives in Kenya. But we are footloose. We'll carry on migrating. But what happens in a planet that's more equal? It's already much more equal than it was, thanks largely to China. But what happens about this relationship between births and their cohort migration? That might have been 30 minutes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes. Leave the floor to questions if
Yeah.
oh.
Or just telling me, and please,
Yeah.
I won't be embarrassed
Yeah.
if you tell me you haven't read the Vienna Yearbook of this for the last 20 years, Danny, don't you know? Or something. Yeah.
I have a question, obviously. That was very, it's based on like how you kind of left the talk. Like, so what actually are the implications of knowing this that we can't, like, where can we use this sort of measure? Because to me it seems like you're relying like quite a lot of retrospective. The time, like to get the projections you need from a long ago.
Yes.
It's not really reactive to situations
Today.
now. Like,
Yeah. Okay. I suppose the main use will be academic, historic, trying to understand the past. Hopefully, if it's useful. I really worry. I honestly worry because, there are more social scientists alive and working today than all the ones that have ever been in history. So there's a huge danger if you think you've got an idea that's good. The probability is it isn't a good idea, otherwise it would be used. So historical understanding the past. But for me, it's migration control. It's just the idea that you can actually control migration. This seems to suggest that it's, whether you think it's ethical to or not, it's pie in the sky. I can remember 20 years ago, 1 million people came out into Heathrow every 3 days. You got 1 million people coming in and out. It's not about small boats. So ultimately, try and stop the boats has been maybe the biggest political slogan in this country for the last 10 years. Stop the boats, the fear of the boats. Every time my father-in-law sees me, he says in his accent from North Yorkshire, "Danny, what are we going to do about the boats?" And he's petrified. And I glibly say, "You live very high up, sea levels rising 20 centimetres a century. By the time there's a beach near you," I say, "it's a long walk from the south coast to your village. Nobody's made it yet." I'll say, "It isn't worth it." And then he might say, "But look at the taxi drivers whose parents were born in Pakistan." And I explain, they didn't come on small boats. And really, you're very lucky that somebody's willing to drive a taxi for you. But it's the politics of migration control, fear, not understanding ourselves, not realising what it is we do, and not realising that it takes place over lifetimes. That you could be New Zealand, say, you can literally close off the borders. We know what happens now with a 2-year closing of borders. And it will have some economic damage to New Zealand. It may not have actually saved many lives net because the detrimental effect of no overseas students might be greater than stopping COVID arriving a little bit early. But New Zealand will even itself out in the long term, regardless. Issues about Fortress Europe. What are we actually playing at with border force? If this is what actually happens. So simple political things like that. And then maybe later, if there's something sensible about this measure, try to use it to identify those places on Earth at those times which were more attractive and growing and those which weren't. And what were the actual circumstances? So why did we need more people? Was it industry, or was it, even in the case of Britain, that we'd become so rich, as the richest place on earth ever, that we didn't have enough people to be servants, and if we're going to keep enough servants, we needed other people to come in to do the jobs that those people would do from Ireland, to build railways. We couldn't use people from England to build railways because we needed people from England to be our servants. We didn't really want an Irish servant. Maybe. I'm speculating. And most importantly, the future. So if European countries in particular have dealt with population issues simply by using the rest of the world as somewhere they can send their surplus population, think of Sweden and Finland and all those Americans whose grandparents came from there. If we've used the rest of the world to deal with when we have too many people, and if we then use the rest of the world for when we don't have enough babies, we have a model of behaving that just assumes that the rest of the world will take us. A bit of a shock. I've only got one passport. Suddenly, oh shit! I'm going to have to die on this cold, wet island. Whereas, so trying to work out to what extent European attitudes to population have been influenced by something that we never realised we were doing quite as precisely. These correlations are really close. And it meant that we always had the labour we needed when we needed it, and we could send people in effect off to Australia with a £10 ticket when we did it, and it might shape our attitude to people. I don't know.
Thanks a lot, Danny. And also reminding us about Ravensteins, or Ravensteins, because originally it was from Germany, laws of migration. I was thinking, there is of course this literature on 19th century and early 20th century migration from Europe, and the effect of the size of a cohort on the migration rate has been calculated. But this is, of course, from period perspective, there is a 25-year delay, because you need to newborn babies get to certain ages before they start looking for jobs and so on. And why it's 25? Because at that time also in some countries families moved, which were in late 20s, and of course also those who were in late teens. And you do, of course, this from kind of lifetime perspective, and then there is a correlation. So I do not remember what was exactly the number. I sometimes show to in my population lectures as well. So this is actually the book by, I don't know how you pronounce it, Chesnais, French historical demographer. The correlation was decent, but I do not remember what it was.
Yeah.
But of course it was not perfect. So I'm just wondering, okay, then from European perspective, sorry, I have to take that from only regarding statistics. Of course, the countries become countries of immigration, and then, the correlation may change.
Yes.
So you show very long-term kind of patterns, and of course it's very much determined by the immigration, the size of the cohort of immigration. But if it becomes country of immigration and the size of the cohorts and number of immigrants, I'm not sure. Maybe this is something to comment or give more information about. And of course, if this correlation is very strong, then we can say either politicians got it right, migration control, or the market gets it right, or both together. Yeah,
that's fascinating. I'd never thought of that. There's the 1880s, 1890s, peaking up to 1905. and then the Aliens Control Act or whatever, and folk coming from Eastern Europe, and Daily Mail cartoons. And I never thought, I should have known, I never thought, of course, all these people coming would have made it more likely for other people to get on boats and go to America and Australia, and so on. I've never seen it, well, at least in the press, it wasn't put like that at the time, that they're going to push you out of the country. It was a lot more, they will have lice, they have their weird foreign ways, and so on. But that certainly, there's a graph that I was very careful not to show for years and years, which was the British Isles net migration figure from the late 1830s. You could almost do it. And there were only 2 events that really mattered in this whole period. And this is when the British Isles was a single country, so a single statistical unity. One was the Irish famine, which I wish I could show it you now, but if you imagine, it's a weird graph. The Irish famine, huge population fall, mainly because of emigration, partly because of deaths, but unprecedented loss of people. And then the only equivalent to the Irish famine was from 2003 onwards, and it was the A8 migration, because we opened up, UK, Ireland, and I think Sweden opened up to the A8 countries, and got the most qualified, most get up and go, most interesting folk, but we got them in huge numbers. And I can remember quietly deciding never to show this graph, but it could be a bit like 1905, that actually something happens at that level which creates a shift, which I've never looked, but it depends on the lag, whether to see whether there was actually an increase in emigration from folk born in England and Wales to compensate for A8 folk arriving. But that's very quick, big, quick things. You know, a lot of this is slowly over time, a lot in people's 20s when you actually want the labour, but hanging around to your 40s and 50s because there's still a need for you. You're not sacked because there aren't enough people of your age. So the standard thing of last in, first out, and we'll all look after each other, doesn't matter if you're in a small size cohort. But no, I hadn't thought about that fitting. It does. And of course this includes retirement migration and going back when you're ill to where you come from or feel happiness with, or somewhere warmer than the cold place you've gone to for work or start a family. So all you're getting here is the only 2 spatial points are actually the point of birth and the point of death. All the other moves in between are not included in this particular measure. Has anybody seen anything like this done? You get life expectancy is done like this. You know, people work out the standard life expectancy is period, but people work out cohort life expectancy. Do it less now because it's not improving, but you know, telling youngsters you'll probably live another 5 or 6 years longer because we expect it to be higher. So it's done for mortality. I suspect it's done for fertility because it would make a lot of sense to say, for most of the world, you are on this downward trajectory. For Europe, we don't know. For Korea, we don't know. For Japan, we don't know. But for most of the world, it'd be very, very surprising if the number of babies doesn't carry on falling for another generation or 2. Just because that's happened everywhere, almost. And even in the poorest, most remote countries in Central Africa, it's occurring. If the figures are right. Go on.
I was just thinking about this sort of fertility decline, but when you talk about the A8 countries and their sending, these are countries that have had traditionally low fertility, and so it doesn't really hold in those countries, surely, because these were these are people from cohorts of few people, and they are migrating. So like Lithuania, like their population's decreased by like 25% in the last 30 years because of brain drain. And I know that there's a measure in like they might return when they get old. But does it hold for all countries, or does it only hold for these examples that you have to date for?
I've only looked at England and Wales and Sweden. Because partly time and partly it's a big project. If you begin to do it, you don't just... I suspect it holds for rich countries, and then it has to partly hold, but more weakly. Net it has to hold perfectly for the rest of the world to balance. But I suspect it is less predictable in that you can substitute Lithuania for Trinidad to an extent, and we have. So you shouldn't find the things looking so deterministically. And for the countries where people have left, it won't so much be birth as ideas of aspiration, the grass is greener, TV, culture, Hollywood, being told. There's a lovely paper once done by a historian at the LSE with a title like Turn Again Dick Whittington about who was it who walked to London in the past and how tall they were. And that feeling of there might be something better, I'll go and do it. You know, that's a really interesting thing about humans. I'm in awe of migrants because I've never migrated. Right? The furthest I ever went was from Oxford to Newcastle. You know, I lived in New Zealand for a bit, but I've never been brave enough to do that, trying to live in another country. So we vary. But the reasons why you might leave Lithuania, we get clues. The simplest clue is men and women. When women leave an area faster, you can kind of guess that maybe the men are not particularly good about doing, sort of be trite, but the washing up or patriarchy in general. And there's flows that come in from further east to Lithuania. So there's this kind of cascading of everybody's moving and stepping, and you're putting barbed wire up on the eastern side of your countries and worrying about people flowing out to the west. And Spain and Italy trying to instigate regulations to stop their youngsters leaving, which kind of seems ridiculous when north of Africa is that near. So it's... This is working for the places that are gaining, or appear to be working. The obvious one I haven't looked at is the USA, because the records just don't go back that long for the USA. And something else is going on in the USA. We were using the USA to dump our European populations, but then the USA rises up to become a place that people actually want to go to. So it's a switch. And you probably would like to do it for each state separately, rather than treat it as a single place. You might get a much more nuanced picture.
Danny, thank you. I'm trying to get my head around this concept actually, because we're so used to thinking about period measures of migration. But I suppose as a thought exercise, it would be fascinating following from Joe's comment to just think through what would be the expectations of this lifetime net migration in relation to fertility for the future, and we can't go much further than we've already gone, and for the other places. What's the theory of how this relationship will change in different contexts and different political change? But I think in terms of this being useful as something to engage in the politics of migration debates, it's probably not the easiest way, because immediately the reaction is going to be okay, there's no geography here. Actually, the politics of migration is not so much net migration is this or that, but that's the headline. It's actually the net migration from this place, which is a proxy for these kinds of people, is this or that. So you wouldn't be able to engage in that debate about which migrants are portrayed as desirable or undesirable. And also, the migration debates are so far removed from a cohort perspective because we're so focused on how migration is part of intergenerational balances and ideas of dependency. That people would say, well, so what if people born in that year, there was a net gain I'm bothered about at that time with the people born in that year coming. So I think it's a hard sell, even though intellectually it's quite fascinating. So they were my reactions to, is this useful? But then I wanted to also ask you more about the figure 7, the country people came from, that I think you said Beth and Thomas did, and how, like, what that's actually showing us in terms of how it was made. So what is that actually?
What is that?
In 1840, in any year, how do you get that breakdown?
How do you get it? It's from the national census tables, the printed ones, for the whole of England and Wales.
So this is proportion of population, or what?
Yeah.
What is the axis?
This is proportion of the total population not born in England and Wales, and where they were born.
Right. Okay.
But so does momentum. Does momentum to the graph then?
Was it?
There's like some level of momentum to the graph, or is it?
No, it's simply a snapshot. It's taking every census,
Yeah.
national volume, and
So it's not flows or anything.
it's not flows. It's simply saying that by 2006, it's not census data, maybe labour force survey, but in 2006, 10% of the population of England and Wales were not born in England and Wales, and is it? It is England and Wales, but I think we deliberately left Scotland out entirely. So what it's showing is that Ireland was always very important, and we treated Ireland in a particular way, you could say politically, over kind of real disregard. And then you begin to see other countries coming in, and the majority of these countries early on are ex-colonies. And the tricky thing that Bethan had to do is work out the name changes, when you treat India all as a whole, when India splits. And it shouldn't have been hard work. Well, you've got to find all the printed volumes. But the shocking thing was that in demography books for Britain, we never have, the standard American thing is, look at what a melting pot we are. Now, London's a much bigger melting pot than New York. And now, for 20 years, we've talked about Londoners, and there's a particular thing going on in London. But so to come back to your question about place, you could calculate this for Fife. So you know the births accurately. You could estimate the deaths by single year of age, even if you haven't got it. You could do pretty well. And so you could work out what's the history of Fife from 1851. And then you could use census snapshots to tell you in times of net in migration, cohort in migration, who was it who came to Fife, or who isn't coming. So there's a way of making it more place-based. It's partly trying to get away from thinking about migration as a thing that happens in a particular year. Because we don't tend to think about births like that. We don't think, let's all talk about the births this year. Births, what matters is how many children people have at one point in their life, at all in their lifetime.
I mean, it fits something with the way literature's going for people looking at individuals. So the individual life course migration literature has boomed in recent years, partly because it's possible to do that with countries that have registers and such, so you can trace people. So this could fit in that sense that, okay, well, let's scale that up, not just following individuals over their life courses, but what's the impact for the nation overall, and how does it relate to other demographic components at that big scale?
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't want to occupy the field, but I could also do kind of ideas on kind of inspired by your talk. So the one thing is, okay, you have UK or Britain, and you have Sweden. I'm speaking about the more historical part because that's currently more. I can kind of I see very very kind of things one can test relatively easily. So these are very kind of typical cases of one site, which are very huge population growth, huge immigration, and huge urbanization. So then there are other cases, like France, where there was population growth, not as high, no immigration. And then there is a Central Europe, where there was a huge growth, but no immigration, because US had closed the borders by that time. It was 1920s, or introduced the quota system, which of course at that time preferred British and was against Eastern Europeans. So in other words, you could extend this within Europe historically and see how it works during that period of demographic transition. Other idea is this stream, very important stream of urbanization. Of course, in many countries, there is no opportunities to go abroad for reasons I just mentioned. So rural-urban migration is the main stream. And of course, you can use, actually in the literature, this is called also cohort survival method, so that you compare the cohort over a long time, and then you can take from life tables the expected mortality, and then the rest is migration, which is residual. And you can do this for 5, but you can do urban rural areas. I know it's more complex because, but you can do, and then it would be interesting to see whether in a way there is no borders, whether the kind of destination areas, the urban areas, so there is a kind of adjustment when the cohorts are smaller, new people are coming in. When the cohorts are bigger, fewer people are coming in from the hinterland or wherever. I know it's more difficult to do, but in geography departments, of course, that's the only place where one can do it properly.
Yeah. Now, thinking about doing it, or to make it a more feasible project, if you did say, let's just do it for Europe and look at the differences within Europe, and then try to just take London and England and Wales and just Paris and France, as simple as that. And that's not, it's a PhD. Even that's an entire PhD. It would let you check for any errors. So, because if there had been sneaky, quiet leaving of France with nobody knowing about it, this would show up this way. If it hasn't been checked, this actually checks that. But yeah, having a city to come into. Amsterdam is the one that fascinates me. And Amsterdam was growing before England and Wales was the richest place on earth before. It's just, what was the political unit around Amsterdam and the United Provinces and the Netherlands? But the story, when you hear the story of something like Amsterdam, it's the story of these families came in and established and were accepted by the second generation and built their merchant house here and so on. London is often a story like Rome, which is that London's never managed to reproduce itself. In the past had such a high infant mortality rate, it always required people to come in. But you're right, these big cities create something different. So just off the top of my head, if I could take out Madrid and Spain and a very simple geography like that, and just Portugal almost as a single country. There are countries like Greece which really are just Athens, demographically. There are some countries which are, the city and the country is almost synonymous. Because Portugal, for England, was a place that we used for agricultural labour. Or the classics, Finland for au pairs. Or Iceland before it. So I always get Angus Magnusson, who's one of the best-known authors in Iceland, who writes about the last glacier and so on. I think it's his great aunt was the au pair for J.R.R. Tolkien. And if you ever read Lord of the Rings and think about where the elves come from, anyway, that was... But, I don't know, I like connecting these migration stories. But Iceland's got incredibly good records. So tiny, but But this method doesn't link anywhere. It just tells you with a potential high degree of accuracy about the net effect in a place. And he was thinking, what would have happened had the French created a much larger empire than the small one they created lately? I think it's interesting, but it very quickly becomes a PhD as a project, and potentially a PhD which might be okay as a PhD, but that might be the end of it. And you can see my worry. I think that's the most likely thing. Odd idea, but actually it's a cul-de-sac. Unless thinking about migration this way is a way of getting us out of thinking about it in a traditional political way as being a problem. Have I exhausted you?
We have gone out
Yes.
out of time, so unless anyone has a final remark or a final question. No.
Thank you for humouring me. Thank you very much.